10th lecture on the book of Ezra and the book of Nehemiah. Today we will begin with Nehemiah chapter 7 verse 5. In verses 5 to 73 are the names of those who returned with Zerubbabel. Read verse 4. Now the city was large and spacious, but there were few people in it, and the houses had not yet been rebuilt. Jerusalem was large and spacious, but there were few people in it. In verse 3, it says the gates of Jerusalem were not to be opened as hot. The gates were to be shut while the gatekeepers were on duty. The people were to guard their posts and near their own houses. The city was large and spacious compared to those who lived there, and there were many areas to guard. Verse 5. So my God put it into my heart to assemble the nobles, the officials, and the common people for registration by families. I found the genealogical record of those who had been the first to return. This is what I found written there. God moved Nehemiah's heart when Nehemiah was his problem. Nehemiah assembled the nobles, the officials, and the common people. Nehemiah then found the genealogical record of those who returned with Zerubbabel. This was guidance of the Holy Spirit. When Nehemiah followed the guidance of the Holy Spirit, God allowed him to find the record of the first return. The first return was in 536 BC. That was the first return from captivity in 70 years since the Israelites were taken captive to Babylon. Nehemiah returned in the third return. Nehemiah returned about 92 years Zerubbabel. The third return took place about 100 years later. Everyone who returned with Zerubbabel had died. Therefore, Nehemiah did not know who returned with Zerubbabel. However, Nehemiah discovered the record of those who returned with Zerubbabel, and he learned who returned from captivity. How many returned at that time? Where did they live after they returned? Did they live in Jerusalem? Did they live somewhere else? Did they first live in Jerusalem and then move to a different place? Why did they move? Nehemiah examined all these things. He was also able to 92 years with the present. He compared and analyzed the families, tribes, and locations. Nehemiah examined all these things and learned from them, and was able to make improvements. Nehemiah did not do this by his will. He was able to do this through prayer and through the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. He found the valuable record by God's grace. The same goes for us today. God allows us to discover valuable records. Read Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 12. I set out during the night with a few men. I had not told anyone God had put in my heart to do for Jerusalem. There were no mounts with me except the one I was riding on. Nehemiah always acted by inspiration from God. It is important that we always obey the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. Nehemiah first came to Jerusalem by obeying the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. Nehemiah also did not do whatever he wanted to when he inspected Jerusalem for the first time. Nehemiah inspected the city by obeying the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. Inspected the city by the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. He was able to find the valuable genealogical record through the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. This was very valuable. God always works in this way. God allowed Nehemiah to discover what happened 92 years earlier. When we inspect and count the number of people by the guidance of the Holy Spirit, God helps us in many ways and pours out His grace upon us. When Zerubbabel returned and built the temple, there was a lack of goods. There were many opposing people at time circumstances were difficult. The enemies at the time asked, "Who allowed you to build the temple?" The Israelites replied, "King Cyrus gave us permission." Through this, the work of the devil took place. The building of the temple was put to a stop for 15 years because of the enemy's interference. Through this, the people learned what to say when the enemies asked, "Who allowed you to build the temple?" In Ezra chapter 5, verse 11, the people replied that the God of heaven and earth allowed them to build the temple. Then God worked to their advantage, found a scroll in the citadel of Ecbatana in Media. Ezra chapter 6, verse 2. When we too obey the guidance of the Holy Spirit, God will prepare good things for us. God allowed Nehemiah to discover a document from 92 years ago. God has many things prepared for us as well. We must believe this. God allowed us to meet favorable circumstances. God guides our footsteps to good places. He allowed the Israelites to discover a document that was favorable to them. The people replied that God and earth allowed them to build the temple. When we go forward with trust in God, He will allow us to discover good things. In verse 5, when Nehemiah obeyed the inspiration of the Holy Spirit and wanted to know genealogies of the people, God allowed him to discover a valuable document from the first return from 92 years ago. What must we be moved by before we act? We will succeed when we obey the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. Do not behave however you want. Our hearts to God's heart. We must throw away our own thoughts. Our thoughts are too narrow. We are self-centered and tend to lean one way only. We are selfish and only think of ourselves. we must throw away all these wrong things. We must change to think like God. Then we can grow closer to God. Acts chapter 8, verse 26 says, "Now an angel of the Lord said to Philip, 'Go south to the road, the desert road, that goes down from Jerusalem to Gaza.'" Spirit told the deacon Philip to go from Jerusalem to Gaza. The road was a desert road. Who did Philip meet when he obeyed the Holy Spirit? Philip met an Ethiopian eunuch, an important official in charge of the treasury of Queen Candace. What was the eunuch reading? He was reading the Bible. Philip then taught him the Bible and baptized him. Hence, Ethiopia received the gospel. When Philip obeyed the guidance of the Holy Spirit, he met a man whom he shared the gospel with. Nehemiah, year-old document. Nehemiah discovered a valuable document. This was God's work. The genealogical record in today's passage is nearly identical to the list in Ezra chapter 2, verses 1 to 7. In how many years did God allow them to record this? God allowed them to record this in the Bible in 92 years. God had them record the same thing again. Records last forever. Records of our actions last. Our faith lasts. Our offerings to God last. The road we walked down lasts. They will never disappear. Our disobedience will be recorded. Our wrongdoings will be recorded. Our stinginess will last. Our faith will be recorded as well. All that we do will be recorded, just as if they were photographed. Everything that we are doing at this moment will be recorded. We must always use our conscience with fear and trembling. It is important that we remain upright in whatever situation we may be in. In verses 6 to 7 are the names of the leaders. Read verses 6 and 7. These are the people of the province came up the captivity of the exiles whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had taken captive. They returned to Jerusalem and Judah, each to his own town, in company with Zerubbabel, Jeshua, Nehemiah, Azariah, Rahamiah, Nahamani, Mordecai, Bilshan, Mizpereth, Bigvai, Nahum, and Baana. The list of the men of Israel. There were 12 leaders. However, Ezra chapter 2 verse 2 lists 11 leaders. Nahamani was included here. He was not included in the record of the first return. In how many years was this recorded? Again, 2 years. When we live by faith, God will allow our names to be recorded in 92 years if it was left out the first time. How many leaders were there? 12. God remembers everything. Even if we are not acknowledged by people, God remembers everything. We can see through verses 6 and 7 how important it is for us to become leaders. We must not be mediocre. We must not remain still. We must not run away. We must be leaders. We must make sure that God is glorified through us. In verses 8 to 24 are the names of families. There are 17 families. Who was the first family to be recorded? Verse 8. The descendants of Parosh, 2,172. The family of Parosh was the first to be recorded. There were 2,172 of them who returned. A large number of this family returned from exile. What was the largest family who returned? Verse 17 of Azgad, 2,322. The descendants of Azgad had the largest number of people who returned from exile. There were 22 of them. The smallest family is in verse 21. Verse 21 of Ader through Hezekiah, 98. The smallest number of people who returned from exile was the descendants of Ader, Hezekiah's descendants. 98 of them returned. All who returned from captivity were recorded. In this way, our faith will be recorded and will remain. The Bible lasts forever on this earth. The total number from among the 17 families was 16,722. However, Nehemiah's number and Ezra, there may have been a difference in the points of view. There is no original document on this earth. We only have a copy. This is because God got rid of the original document because it could have been an idol to people. The copy was a written copy of the original document. There may have been mistakes on the copy. If there was a difference between the original and the copy, it was probably because the people added the number of those who returned later. Therefore, the numbers are not significant. The entire Bible was written by the inspiration of 2 Timothy chapter 3 verse 16. In verses 25 to 28 to 38 is the list of regions. There are 21 regions. What region had the largest group of people who returned from captivity? Verse 38 of Senah, 3,930. The descendants of Senah had the largest number of people. Their number was 3,930 when they returned from captivity. What region had the smallest number of people? Verse 28 of Beth Asmaveth, 42. The smallest group was the descendants of Beth Asmaveth. 42 returned captivity. Nothing was added to or subtracted from the Bible. The total number of people who returned from 21 regions was 8,684. Isaiah chapter 43 verse 5 and 6 says, "Do not be afraid, for I am with you. I will bring your children from the east and gather you from the west. I will say to the north, give them up, and to the south, do not hold them back. Bring my sons from afar, and my daughters from the ends of the earth. In this way, all God's precious people will come from all directions. The descendants of captivity are even more precious. In verses 39 to 45 is the list of the priests and the Levites. How many priests returned? It says that 4,289 returned. Verse 39, the priests, the descendants of Jediah, through the family of Jeshua, 973. The total number of priests who returned in verses 39 to 42 is 4,289. Many priests returned from captivity. Then how many Levites returned? It is in verses 43 to 45. Verse 43 says that 74 Levites returned from captivity. The number of Levites who returned was small. They did not live by faith. They did not increase. In Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 1 to 3, it says that those who keep God's decrees and commands will increase and enjoy long life. Families who keep their faith will increase. We will enjoy long life and receive blessings when we fear God and obey God's commands. In verse 44, the singers returned from captivity. There were 148 of them. In verse 45, the gatekeepers returned. There were 138 of them from 6 different regions. 6 is the list of the temple servants. The descendants of the temple servants were from 32 families. The descendants of the temple servants did the most humbling work in the temple. They drew water in the temple. They cut wood. They helped the Levites. However, no other group of people was as numerous as the descendants of the temple servants. God allows servants of God to increase in number. God allows faithful servants of God to increase. In verses 57 to 60 is the list of the descendants of the servants of Solomon. Verse 57, the descendants of the servants of Sotai, Sophereth, Perida. Solomon was David's son. He lived around 950 BC. God allows obedient descendants to succeed. God let the temple servants thrive. There is no work of God that is lowly. All of God's works are valuable. The Lord's works are beautiful. In verses 61 to 65 is the list of those with uncertain genealogies. First, there are those who could not show that they were from Israel. Verse 61. The following came up from the towns of Tel Melah, Tel Harsha, Kerub, Adon, Immer, but they could not show that their families were descended from Israel. There were 642 people with uncertain genealogies. We must know where we are from. It is not right to go back and forth. We must say yes to what is right and no to what is wrong. In verse 63, there were priests with uncertain genealogies. The names of those who took their priesthood lightly and those who gave up their priesthood were not on the list. They also were no longer allowed to enter the Holy of Holies. We must always be sure of our genealogies. Verses 66 to 73 speak of people and the gifts that were brought from exile. How many returned in total? Verse 66. The whole company numbered 42,360. There were 42,360 who returned from captivity. How many servants returned? Verse 67. Besides their 7,337 men servants and maid servants, and they also had 245 men and women singers. There were 7,337 servants who returned. There were 245 singers who returned. About 50,000 people returned. What about the animals? Verses 68 to 69. There were 36 horses, 245 mules, 435 camels, and 6,720 donkeys. There were 736 horses that returned. There were 245 mules. There were 435 camels that returned. There were 6,720 donkeys that returned. A total of 8,136 animals returned. God made the people record the number of animals that returned as well. It is important that we return. In verses 70 to 72 are the gifts that were given to God. Verse 70: Some of the heads of the families contributed to the work. The governor gave to the treasury 1,000 gold, 50 bowls, and 530 garments for priests. The gifts that were given to God were recorded. 1 drachma is about 8.4 grams. Some heads of families contributed to the work. The governor gave 1,000 drachmas of gold, 50 bowls, and 530 garments for priests. Some heads of families gave 20,000 drachmas of gold and 2,200 minas of silver. The rest of the people gave 20,000 drachmas of gold, 2,000 minas of silver, and 67 garments for priests. The people gave gold, silver, bowls, and garments for priests. They stored their faith in heaven. This is how we can become rich in heaven. In verse 73, the people settled in their own towns. Verse 73, the priests, the Levites, the gatekeepers, the singers, and the temple servants, along with certain of the people and the rest of the Israelites, settled in their own towns. When the 7th month came and the Israelites had settled in their towns, the priests, the Levites, the gatekeepers, the singers, certain people, the temple servants, and the rest of the Israelites settled in their own towns. It was important that they settle in their own towns. We must settle in places that God built, no matter what the environments may be like. There are servants need to be in. There are places that the singers need to be in. There are places that the gatekeepers need to be in. There are places that God built up. We must remain there so that we can receive God's care. We must be content and thankful. Psalm 16 verse 6 says, "The boundary lines have fallen for me in pleasant places. Surely I have a delightful inheritance." We must know that the place God chose for us is the most delightful place. Then God will protect us and bless us. Here we will conclude the 10th lecture on Ezra and Nehemiah. Thank you.